When I show how violent Islam is, I generally get the criticism that I'm taking things out of context. I am when I show bad verses, when I show disgusting verses, disgusting things, doctrines in that religion, people say that you always pick the bad ones, or there are contradictory verses. You always took the bad ones. So I want to talk about one thing. This is not objective as you guys think it is. Okay, so because you need to be having the premise that it is not actually that violent. You need to have the premise that you always choose the bad ones. Saying you always choose the bad ones actually is not an objective claim. You guys are not objective and looking at the situation from a distance and objectively deciding what is the case. No, because you are always doing this only when the examples are bad. When there is a bad verse, when there is a disgusting practice, then you guys think that there is actually more to it. There can be actually more to it. But I never see these quote unquote objective people think like that when there is a good verse, when there is a morally good verse, or not disgusting verse. Also, don't forget about how desperate people are to find something that is not disgusting, right? So don't forget how hard it is. But let's say you find one. Do you ever think that maybe there is a more to it? Maybe this is out of context. You never think that, right? You never think that. Why don't you think that? If you are an objective person, why don't you think that? So this, you are always choosing the bad verses, actually accepts the premise that when there is a bad verse, it is always out of context. It actually has an explanation. But you are supposed to not knowing what it is. You're just supposed to be an objective person, right? You're just trying to determine. That's what you're claiming. You're just someone outside trying to determine the situation. So how do you know that? Oh, I always choose the bad ones. How do you know that when there is a good verse, in my case, that good verse is out of context? How do you know that? Saying you always choose the bad verse means there is always good verses. There is always good verses opposite what you are saying, and we will choose. How do you know that when in a case, in a scenario, okay, some action and the comments, the cases, Islamic data we have about it, hadiths for example, when there is a conflict, there are two things as a result. One is bad, one is a bad thing to do, one is morally bad command, and one is morally good. You always automatically think that that good one is actually what the verse talks about, what Islam teaches, and the bad one is out of context. But how do you know that? How do you know that? For example, there are cases like this in the Quran. There are verses that say you should, some religious freedom of religion. Let them believe their beliefs. We believe ours. Let everyone believes their beliefs. This kind of verse. It was the Kafirun, the name of the chapter, if I don't remember wrong. So, for example, I always hear people using this verse. Have you ever thought that this is actually out of context? Or maybe there's a hadith that says killing a person is like killing everyone in the world. When there are things like that, don't even think about how fringe these are, right? But let that aside. When you find things like that, do you ever think, maybe these are out of context? Maybe there is more to it. No, you never think that. So you always think that I choose the bad ones deliberately. So there are always good ones, and those good ones are the actual context. Those are the actual points that has this premise in it. Okay? I choose the bad ones. How do you know that? Yeah, so I choose the bad ones. Meaning it actually means something different. It actually has something different. So when there is a bad verse and a good verse about something, you always choose the bad one. So, but how do you know I shouldn't? How do you know I shouldn't? How do you know that's not the right approach? So this actually has the premise that the ultimate meaning is different than mine, different than the explanation I give. Okay, so you are not as objective as you think you are. Like I said, do you ever think, is there more to it when you see a good verse? No, you immediately accept it and say, oh, look, this is what it is. This is what Islam is. This is what Islam is, right? You think that. Well, actually, when that verse came, that freedom of religion verse came, Muhammad had no power, no military power, no population, anything, no companions, so little. He had so little amount of people following him. When he migrated to Medina, that's when the violent verses start. When he went Medina and had power, had more people, then the violent verses start. And if you read the Quran in a chronological order, Quran normally is not in a chronological order, the official order. So if you read the Quran in a chronological order, you see that there is an incredible increase in the violence. Chronologically, the last verse is by far the most violent one. It is the chapter 9. Go read it. I dare you. It is the most violent one. So don't come to me and say, oh, you just hate Muslims and think. So these things have the premise that that religion is not actually that bad. But how do you know? This is also not an objective view. What if it actually is? Yes, it is, by the way. Yes, Islam is that bad. Islam is that violent. Okay? So it is actually not an objective view. Okay? If something, some idea is actually that bad, you cannot decide that, oh, you are talking too bad about it. What if it actually is? This is the point. When you talk, for example, I give you explanations about Nazism, Nazi ideology. When there are horrible things, do you automatically think, okay, but let's not say those things. Let's be, let's don't take out of context. You don't say those things. Why? Because you actually know that, yes, they are that bad. That's why you don't intervene and stop people. No, wait, but that is so hateful, what you're saying. That is so hateful. But at some point, if something is that violence, explaining it involves talking that much hatred about that ideology, right? Is there a good way to explain Nazism without causing any hatred towards Nazis? Is it possible? So at some point, saying that, oh, you shouldn't, say generalizing things. You shouldn't, say show people of this religion so violent. At some point, saying this is not objective. Saying this is just starting with the premise that that religion is actually not that violent. Okay? So it is not objective. You are starting with the premise that it is not that violent. This is the point. How do you know? How do you know that? Maybe what I say is true. Yeah, for example, like I said, do you ever think when a good verse come up, do you ever think that maybe there's more to it? In most cases, yes, there are. But you only think that, you only need to feel the need to interrupt and stop when there is a bad verse. You always choose the bad verse. You actually always choose the good verses. And they are always out of context. Like, for example, that killing one person is like killing everyone. It actually has a different word to it, and it means only Muslims. It only means Muslims. Yeah, that's the reality of it, for example. It is actually this easy to see the context of this, but you never heard of it, do you? You never heard of it, did you? You just accepted that, oh yes, this is actually what Islam is, and all those extremists are extremists. They just radicals, they just don't understand their scripture. They read it, they read, they study all the documents on Islam all their life, but they still didn't realize that one sentence in front of me is the actual key point. That is actually what Islam teaches. They are so stupid to realize that. So this is what you're doing. you guys are not objective at all. You guys are starting with the premise that it is actually not that violent. Okay? But you don't know that. You act like you're objective, but you actually never think the same. If you would be thinking the same when there is a good verse, then I would say nothing about it. Because this is how you search, how you do research, right? This is how you do research. When something comes up, you think maybe there is more to it. Yes, obviously this is how you be objective, but you only do this when there is a bad verse. So when you do that, it implies that you think that there is always an other ultimate meaning. An ultimate meaning is always different than yours, the bad ones. And this needs the premise that it is actually not that violent.